everybody. On behalf of the Highland Park Public Library, we'd like to welcome you to Library in Your Living Room. We are pleased to present Shelf Isolation, a weekly mini-series about books, culture, and what to read next. I'm Sara, and this is your Information and Reader Services Department. In this episode, we are excited to share with you what we've been reading, watching, and or listening to during self-isolation. And to begin our mini-series, I'm going to turn things over to our interlibrary loan expert, Stephanie.
Thank you, Sara. Well, I know that no one really knows what's going on in the world right now, so I thought I would continue with that. I followed doing some presidential type reading, and the first book that I did was Make Russia Great Again by Christopher Buckley. Surprise, it's sort of a take on what's going on now. However, it's his look at if the tables were turned and everything was happening in Russia. So the book starts out with Herb Nutterman, who is the newest chief of staff for Donald Trump for his presidency. And the book, it's pretty interesting. It's really hard to figure out who the characters are that he's talking about, because instead of Ivanka, there's Ivanka. Instead of Jared, there's Jorid. Instead of Kellyanne Conway, you've got Katie Borgia O'Reilly. And then there's a Fox commentator whose name's Corky Fart Martin. And then we have a South Carolina senator with the name of Senator Squiggly Biscuit. So leave you a little bit to your imagination. Sadly, Herb is writing his memoir from prison, and he never intended to be Donald Trump's White House chief of staff. He had worked for Trump Organization for 27 years in the hospitality part, so he didn't really have a lot of experience going into it. But anyway, he was named the chief of staff. And before that, he had been doing food and beverage manager, like I said, for Trump. He was at Trump Magnifica. He was at Trump Bloody Run Golf Course. And his boss always referred to him as his favorite Jew and called him to take his daunting role of chief of staff. Herb's wife was telling him, don't pick up the phone when she saw the caller ID. But of course, he picked up the phone. So she's in the kitchen, kind of slamming pots and pans at the beginning of the story around and stuff, and keeps telling him, don't do anything for him, on and on. But he does. So the story, basically what it's about is Herb gets deeply involved in Russia. He also is deflecting rumors about Mike Pence's high school, that he may have been involved in a satanic cult. And he's also leading the re-election campaign for Trump. It is, I will say, I thought I would laugh a lot more, but I think because a lot of what's in the story that Buckley does a great job of making fun of is really in the news. So it was kind of some of the humor was really good. Some of it was sort of high school humor too. But I did enjoy it. If you want a good laugh, it was very enjoyable. So the next one that I read was Sex with Presidents by Eleanor Herman. And this book left me shocked, saddened, and just disappointed by our fearless leaders of our country. Many of the former presidents, no idea what they were up to in the Oval Office. But some interesting statistics, 3 US presidents have been accused of rape. Only one didn't deny it. And that one was Grover Cleveland, who wasn't elected once, but twice. And the interesting thing about him was, when he was an attorney and he was a bachelor, he was friends with a lady, that very, very nice widow who was making ends meet, working in a department store, doing very, very well, a really lovely person. He convinced her to go to dinner with them, so she did. And then afterwards, because he knew her landlady, she invited him in. And she thought that everything would be safe because her 10-year-old son was asleep in the other room. Well, let's just say it wasn't. And what ended up was that she became pregnant with Grover Cleveland's child. Grover Cleveland took care of everything as far as sending the lady to a hospital for unwed mothers. She had the child. He took the child immediately away from her. Wouldn't let her see him for 2 years, but he also wouldn't raise him, even though the child's name at that time was, the name given was the last name Cleveland. It ends up later that the doctor who he set all this stuff up with ended up actually raising the son. And so now Grover wasn't finished there. He was a ward of a young girl. One of his best friends passed away. So he watched her throughout as she grew up and stuff, and he started paying a lot of attention to her as she got older. But her mother was under the impression that he was interested in the mother and thought that he was going to soon ask her to marry him. They didn't. He asked the young ward, who was 21. So she became the youngest first lady. in the US. Another one that surprised me was Warren Harding. I haven't read a lot about him, but he ended up being one of the most corrupt presidents. Well, the reason why he was corrupt was a lot of people contributed to a slush fund for hush money for all the women that he had affairs with while he was president. Well, one of those was a girl from his hometown, and she was a girl who was infatuated with him from the time she was like 12. Well, when she became 18, she met him, ended up having his love child. And that was another thing. Her name was Nan Britton. At the time, it was kind of dismissed that, this lady, this girl, she's making it up and stuff. Well, when Harding passed away, the slush fund went away for all these people. So all these stories started coming out, and his wife, what she did was she burned half of all the information that was in the office at that time and stuff from his presidency. And one of the things Nan Britton said, hey, I need more money, because he had been funding her and the child for quite some time. And instead they thought, he's dead, what's she gonna do? Well, she wrote the first ever tell-all about her relationship with Warren Harding. So those were just two of the stories. There's Alexander Hamilton. They think that the reason why Jackie Kennedy Onassis had trouble having children was because Kennedy had venereal disease. It's a very fascinating read. You find out a lot of stuff that is a lot of oversharing, but it's also interesting how as time moves on, the press would not touch any of this. Like, they wouldn't report these things and stuff. It was just sort of like common practice. We're not going to say anything about the president, that's the president and stuff. And then just over time, how it kind of changed. Like, the one that really surprised me was that Eisenhower fell in love with his driver during World War II. Anyway, it's a really fascinating read. Again, it's Sex with Presidents by Eleanor Herman, and I highly recommend it. And that's about all I have from the election front as far as from my home, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gus.
That does sound pretty interesting. For this week, for me, I didn't read anything about presidents, nor have I ever. I don't know, that may be a subject I haven't been interested in yet, but maybe I'll read the last one. That sounds really interesting. But for this week, I wanted to do something different, as I usually do. You guys don't know what I'm going to do next, right? This week, I read a true crime book, and it's called The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. Now, it is about the untold lives of the women killed by Jack the Ripper. This is it's thoroughly researched. She did a lot of research in this book, and it's really fascinating what these women were. But Jack the Ripper was known for killing, I guess, a lot of people think it was prostitutes and things like that, but they weren't. Some of them were married, they had kids and stuff like that. And it's just a fascinating story of specifically the women he killed. It was, they all was 1888 that the murders happened. So, and I know you guys, nobody knows who Jack the Ripper is, but it's really fascinating to hear about these women's stories. And like I said, it's really deeply researched, so you get a lot of details, which is really nice. And I thought it was very well written, and it's a quick read, and it was very fascinating for me. I also have been playing a game. I know everybody here knows the PlayStation 5 is coming out in a couple of days. I know you guys probably pre-ordered yours. Will, hopefully you did. But I was inspired, okay? I was actually inspired this week by Nintendo, because Nintendo has started a new thing for the Nintendo Switch where it can stream a game. So what it means is that you can play games that not normally you would think to play on a handheld system, so they're really good. So one of those games is called Control. Now I know this is the Xbox version, I go PlayStation, Nintendo, Xbox, I know. But the only reason I bought this on the Xbox was it was pretty cheap. But it's a great game, so it's well worth the price. I just, low on funds at the moment. It's a third-person shooter. It's really good. It's made by Remedy. They also made Quantum Break, which I thought was really good. That came out a few years back, and I believe they also made Alan Wake, for those of you guys that know. It is available for the PlayStation 4 and for the Nintendo Switch as well. So with that, that's all I've been doing this week, aside from, my normal day-to-day life. I haven't been doing two things all week, okay? So with that, I'll go ahead and give it to Sara.
Thanks, Gus. So, as usual, I have a recommendation from my 2-year-old. I actually had planned to talk about a different book that he was liking, but he's made me read this one before nap time and bedtime yesterday and today, so it's clearly the favorite of the moment. And this is We Are Growing by Laurie Keller. And this is part of a series called Elephant and Piggy Like Reading. So they're not by Mo Willems like the Elephant and Piggy books. They're by other authors. The series has a lot of different authors, but they're similar to Elephant and Piggy in that they're comic book style, quick and easy to read, very funny. And the best part, if you are an Elephant and Piggy fan, is that Elephant and Piggy show up at the beginning of the book reading this book. So it's very meta and cute and funny. And this one is about grass, but my toddler loves it. So that's what Henry's been reading this week. And what I've been reading, the first book I actually haven't finished quite yet, but it's called Blue Ticket by Sophie Mccintosh. And it's a dystopian novel set, I believe, in England. It's never explicitly said, but it's a world where when young women hit puberty, they get either a white ticket or a blue ticket. And a white ticket means that they will become a wife and a mother. And a blue ticket means that they can have a career, but will never have children. So the main character, Calla, gets a blue ticket. And at first, she's really enjoying her life. She's starting her career, but she just keeps wanting to have a child. And so eventually she sort of tricks a man. Well, she also removes her IUD and there's other stuff. But anyway, so she ends up pregnant and then is on the run because she does not have a white ticket and is not supposed to have a baby. And I have not finished it yet. I don't know how it ends, but it's fascinating. And in reviews, there are a lot of comparisons to The Handmaid's Tale. And that's one thing that, for me, if I see a book compared to The Handmaid's Tale, I'm probably going to read it. So that's the first book I was reading this week. The second book is very different from that, much, much later. And, well, waiting for election results this week and frantically refreshing the New York Times website, I needed something very light. So I listened to Mind the Gap, Dash and Lily by Rachel Cohn and David Levithan. It's the third in their Dash and Lily series, and it's a teen romance set at Christmas. I won't say much about it other than the Mind the Gap references both that Lily is taking a gap year before starting college and that it takes place in London. But the series in general, it's two teenagers in the first book, Dash and Lily's Book of Dares, which was published, I think, 10 years ago now. They meet because of a notebook hidden at the Strand bookstore in New York City, and they send the notebook back and forth, and it's by two authors, so each author writes one of the two perspectives. But the main reason that I remembered that I wanted to read this is that it's being made into a Netflix series, which starts soon. I can put the date in the show notes. But it's going to be an 8-episode series based on the first book, Dash and Lily's Book of Dares. And it's very cute. And if you're looking for a teen Christmas romance to distract from everything going on in the world right now, it's a great one. And with that, I will pass it on to Catherine.
Thanks, Sarah. The first book I have to share tonight is called Initiated, Memoir of a Witch by Amanda Yates Garcia. So Amanda Yates Garcia, who is also known as the Oracle of Los Angeles, is a practicing witch. So the subtitle there is not a metaphor. And I picked this up just because I was interested in the story of someone from a religion that I didn't know very much about. So the first thing that surprised me, because the author starts when she's very young, is that witchcraft is actually the religion that she was raised in. And she sort of tells the story of her family situation. Her mother was a witch, and so sort of initiated her into witchcraft when she was young, and it was just their family's practice. It's sort of a combination memoir of when she is exploring her religion and her religious tradition, but also just the things that happen to her in her life. So she gets older, as you might expect of a memoir of someone who then is becoming a young adult and a slightly older adult. She has some bad relationships. She talks about her family a lot. She has a bad girlfriend who is a drug dealer, and then a bad boyfriend who, I have to say, is not as bad as the bad girlfriend, but he was not ultimately the right guy for her. But as all of this goes on, as you might expect of someone who grew up in a different religion, she becomes more and more sort of attuned to deciding that the religious life is the life that she wants to, devote her life to, that she wants to devote her life to her religious tradition. So that was pretty interesting. So as I mentioned, she is now the Oracle of Los Angeles. And the book sort of ends with her getting closer to a mother a little bit, which was also interesting. And throughout the book, she really sort of draws on the power of various goddesses and talks about them, which was another interesting aspect. I think that I had this preconceived notion, which I guess was not entirely true, that witchcraft is really a sort of female religion, but it actually, in some instances, is very patriarchal. And Amanda Yates Garcia sort of works on reclaiming that and sort of, rejecting those patriarchal aspects instead for being sort of a woman-centered power herself. So it was a really interesting book. I learned some things I didn't know. For example, that Wicca is actually a new religion that was started in the 1950s, but witchcraft itself is much more ancient, as I think we all realize. So I recommend that one. It's also a pretty light and fast read. It's not too dense, not too long, which is always a nice thing for something you're just picking up because you're curious. The other book I have to share is Migrations by Charlotte Mcconaughey, which is a novel. Mcconaughey is an Australian author, and I think this is her first novel. It is about a woman, Franny, who is studying birds, and in sort of the near future of this novel, there's a lot of mass extinction. Birds are becoming rarer and rarer, but she discovers that there are still some Arctic terns. And these are birds that actually migrate from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back again. It's like the longest migration of any bird. So really fascinating. And in the book, she has managed to put trackers on a few, and she wants to follow them on their migration. And to do so, she ends up on a fishing boat, and they're sort of working with her to follow the birds. But fishing is also becoming a sort of dangerous and more highly regulated practice because of the fish also disappearing. So one of the things that really struck me as I read this book was I could not readily think of other examples of a woman as part of a ship's crew that wasn't a spaceship. And I'm sure that maybe there's some books out there. As I thought more about it, the only one I can remember is The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, which I read as a kid. There's got to be one since then. But anyway, that was really interesting. The book is a little bit unusual in part. I mean, it's kind of clear in an indefinable way, it's not an American novel. I mean, clearly it's not an American novel because it's by an Australian. But, it's just a slightly different outlook on things that makes it feel a little foreign, but in a way that I enjoyed. Franny is not an entirely likable narrator and not an entirely reliable narrator. As we get more and more of her story, we find out there's some things in her past that are sort of secret and some things that she doesn't even know about herself or where she comes from. But through it all, as she's on this wild adventure to follow these birds, she has a husband back at home in Ireland, but she can't seem to stay there with him. He's a lecturer at a university. He's happy to stay there, on dry land where it's safe. He wants her to stay with him, but she basically migrates the way the birds do. She just can't stay at home. So there's that tension in the novel. It's sort of a love story, although not a romance. I liked it a lot. And that is all I have to say. So I will pass it to Nancy.
Thank you, Catherine. Since we're talking about election, I thought I might share one of my absolute favorite images in the archives. And there's a print, we have a print as well as the copy that was in the newspaper, and it's available on DPLA and the Illinois Digital Archive and on WorldCat. And it is of Grandma Brand. Mrs. Brand was an immigrant from Alsace, and after the Illinois Suffrage Act of 1913, she voted in the 1916 presidential election. And she also lived in her mid-90s to vote in the 1920 election. She died in 1921. But why I'm bringing up instead of the print, this newspaper, and the early Highland Park newspapers have been digitized with money from the Highland Park Library Friends, which is very handy for looking up all kinds of things and information. There's a quote, and they asked, when asked for an expression on women's suffrage, Mrs. Brand said, "Women's suffrage is a good thing, if they vote intelligently, for it cannot be gainsaid in view of all that has come to pass, that ultimately we may have a woman president. So we don't have a woman president, we have a woman vice president. So that's kind of interesting. That's a great picture. And I also wanted to share for a paper presented this weekend on the history of sports. In Lake County, we used several of really wonderful collections. We have 3 collections. And the one is in collaboration with the Park District a couple years ago, and funding from the Illinois Secretary of State. We digitized the early minutes of the Chicago Park District, which are available online. And here you talk about the formation of the Park District and public spaces. And I'm going to go back, and we talked about 3 things in this presentation: women in the public sphere, open public spaces, and public safety. And chiefly used 3 collections available online. The Asoli Club, the actual first, not the first independent, but the first women's club in Illinois, and all their records are digitized. They were given to the library in the 1930s and kind of lost for a while, but rediscovered and now digitized. And they created the first public beach in Highland Park. And as I mentioned, the Park District, which we collaborated to digitize and make available online. And also, this is not digitized, and we have a wonderful scrapbook by Roland Brand, who is a young man who is very interested in water safety. And through the same club as the Highland Park Club that the Asoli Club was part of, he helped with safety, with having water rescues and setting up a life-saving station, having lifeguards on the beach, because drowning and water safety were a terrible problem. And these young men who were volunteers would go out and actually several miles out sometimes and rescue boats that were stranded off Highland Park. There you can see this was on was called Central Avenue Beach, just below Central and Park Avenue on the beach in Highland Park. And so those are 3: the Roland Brand collection, the Asoli Club records, and the Park District of Highland Park records that are really great resources that are available online for people to do research and learn more about history and how things happen. And that's all I have, and I will pass it off to Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. This week, I'm very excited because this is going to be the release of the Xbox Series X/S and the PlayStation 5, which heralds the 9th generation of home console releases. If you are a person, like our friend Gus, who has managed to successfully pre-order, congratulations on rising above overloaded website servers and highly persistent scalpers. For the rest of us, sad panda, the future is full of repeated F5 pressing and waiting and wishing and hoping that soon. Anyway, here's a couple of books you can look at during the downtime of all that F5 pressing. Now, if you have any curiosity as to how far we've come in these 9 generations, check out The Game Console, a photographic history from Atari to Xbox by Evan Amos. Starting in the late 70s and carrying into the modern day, discounting this week's releases, Amos provides a brief description and photos of almost every video game console that was produced and mass marketed. And there are a lot. Some, like the major Nintendo, Sega, Sony, and Atari releases, are pretty well known, although it was kind of nice to see some of the early versions of the Master System and the Genesis from their releases in Japan. Some are familiar if you came up during the 80s and 90s when the console competition was most fierce. ColecoVision, TurboGrafx-16, the Philips CDI, the Wonder Swan. Some are things I'd never heard of. Like, I had no clue that VTech made 4 attempts to break into this market going back to 1982 and as recently as 2006. And some just made me laugh. Like, I remember begging my parents for the Nintendo Virtual Boy, despite it giving me a headache that was so bad I almost vomited. And the Nokia N-Gage that my one friend was absolutely sure would herald the beginning of an interest in video gaming on your cell phone, which we all laughed to his face. Yeah, we were wrong. And still more consoles. With 85 being represented in the entire book, you should find at least something that will pique your interest. The other book I recommend is Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier. Now, Schreier is probably one of my favorite journalists covering the video game industry right now, as he specializes in in-depth investigative articles that shine a light on some of the more questionable practices involved in the making of modern video games. In this book, he builds on that to detail the process behind the production of 10 games, each varying in scope, resources, and reception. Each tackles the fundamental issues of what it means to produce a commercial piece of art with hundreds of moving pieces and all the different ways you can approach that problem. For example, Uncharted 4, it meant having the development team put in mandatory overtime to meet exacting standards that had been set by the studio. Meanwhile, there's a game like Stardew Valley that nearly broke the body and mind of its sole creator over the 5 years it took to make the game playable. Still others, like Diablo 3, were made successfully only to have the fan base reject it and force the studio to totally remake one of the more questionable aspects of the game, which eventually led to its success, which is more than can be said for Star Wars 1313, which, despite having the backing of one of the largest game companies in the world and being one of the most popular corporate properties ever, ends up getting canceled. If you want a better understanding of how this sausage is made, it's a great place to start. And with that, I will pass it on to Laurie.
Thanks, William. I did not get my pre-order in for PlayStation 5, so I'm guessing Hanukkah Charlie will not be bringing it to me either. Anyway, that's okay. I'm fine. In the past week, I read a book called Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood, and I'm hoping it's the first in a series about a young woman named Willow Jean Kerr, who is a runaway who actually did join a circus. This particular story takes place in 1942, and she tells a little background about how she joined a smaller circus and it became her family, and she learned all sorts of aspects of it, among other things, a very accurate knife throwing ability. And when the circus came to New York, they got jobs guarding a construction site in the evening because the circus was not making a whole lot of money. And as she was guarding the construction site, a woman came in, and intrigue. Anyway, Willow Jean ends up saving this woman's life by her knife throwing ability, and the woman, Lillian Pentecost, takes her on as her assistant. Lillian also suffers from multiple sclerosis, and it's kind of unusual that you have protagonists in mystery. Well, I guess Ironsides was he was in a wheelchair, but I don't know if that was a book. So she has this degenerative disease. She takes Willow Jean on as her assistant, and Willow Jean comes to live in her house with her, kind of quirky family. And anyway, they get caught up in a case and they solve it. And it's a pretty interesting book. I recommend it. It's a new book. I hope that I'm not going to tell you how it ends. But I did actually read the whole book. I didn't even skip to the end like I usually do. And I hope that he writes more with these characters, because I'd like to see how they grow and mature. The only other thing I wanted to mention, I have been listening to really for months now, There Goes Rhymin' Simon by Paul Simon, which is one of those CDs where almost every song on it is really good. I've been really enjoying it, and with my drive into work, it is almost the perfect length. And there's a song on it, it came out in 1973, and there's a song on it called An American Tune, which if you listen to it, it has made me realize that things have been pretty rotten in America in the past too. And so we've moved on. And anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm hopeful that, anyway, it's not on Hoopla. I don't know if the library has it, but I enjoy it. And that's it. That's all I have to say. So I'm going to pass it back to Sara to lead us out.
Thanks, Laurie. And that's it for today, folks. As always, please remember that we are all here for you. We are available for comments, questions, or concerns that you may have, and you can reach us online through Facebook at facebook.com/HPLibrary, through our Twitter, which is @HPLibrary, or via email at hppla@hplibrary.org. Because the library's hours and services can change suddenly due to COVID, it's best to check our website or contact us via email or chat before coming to the library. Our music today was Carefree by Kevin Mccloud, and you can find more information about this and the titles we mentioned in our show notes below. Okay, everybody, this is us, signing off. Until next time, stay safe.